like to introduce you to Patience. This is one of our quilts in our stained glass block collection, and I'd like to show you what you need in order to make Patience. The supplies that you will need to do the stained glass block of Patience is you're going to need some spray starch. To spray starch your fabric, you're going to need a temporary spray adhesive to attach the back of the fabric to your hoop. You're going to need a hoop scissors in order to trim your fabric welts in the hoop. You're going to have some way, and this is a USB jump drive, to transfer the design to your machine. When the block is finished, you're going to need a trimmer or a trimmer 2.0 in order to trim your blocks properly. And the fabric that you're going to need is your fabric 1 and your fabric 3, your fabric 4, and also a square of your fabric 4. This is my fabric 5. You're going to need your black or gray or whatever color you choose for your lead, your backing fabric. You're also going to need a pre-wound embroidery bobbin or embroidery bobbin thread. You're going to need Vanish Light or water-soluble thread. And you're going to need thread B, thread C, and thread D with matching bobbins. For step number 1, you're going to hoop your battleizer, and you're going to place neutral thread in the needle and embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and the machine will sew the design outline. For step number 2, you're going to place water-soluble thread in the needle and lay your fabric 4 right side up over that little section, and the machine will sew tack down stitches. For step 3, you're going to place your thread B in the needle only, and then you're going to sew the fill that will be the center of the flower. For step 4, you're going to lay your skinny lead fabric right side down over fabric 4, and with neutral thread in the needle, you're going to sew the seam. For step 5, you're going to flip your lead fabric right side up and finger press, and the machine will stitch a tack down stitch. If necessary, you can trim a 1/4 of an inch inside the block and leave a 1/2 an inch on the outside of the block. For step 6, you're going to place your fabric 1 right side down, raw edges even, over the lead fabric and stitch the seam. Step 7, you're going to flip your fabric 1 right side up and finger press, and then you're going to sew the tack down stitch. For step 7, you're going to trim the fabric 1 approximately 1/4 of an inch inside the block. For step 8, you're going to take your skinny lead fabric and lay it right side down over fabric 1 and stitch the seam. Step 9, you can flip the lead fabric right side up, finger press, and the machine will sew the tack down stitches. If necessary, you can trim a 1/4 of an inch inside the block and leave about a 1/2 an inch on the outside of the block. And then you're going to find your fabric 4 and you're going to lay it right side down, raw edges even, over that lead fabric, and the machine will stitch a seam. On step 11, you're going to flip your fabric 4 right side up, and with water-soluble thread in the needle, you're going to sew the tack down stitches. And then you can trim a 1/4 of an inch inside the block, and anywhere on the outside of the block, leave about a 1/2 an inch. You're going to take your skinny lead fabric and lay it down on that side and take it to the machine with neutral thread in the machine, and you can stitch the seam. And now you can flip your lead fabric right side up, finger press, and let the machine stitch the tack down. And trim 1/4 inch inside the block and leave about 1/2 inch on the outside of the block. And then you're going to take your fabric one and place it right side down over the lead fabric and let the machine stitch the seam. Now you can flip your fabric one right side up and finger press, and the machine will sew the tack down stitches. And now you can trim a scant 1/4 inch inside the block. And then for step 16, you're going to need your skinny lead fabric, and you're going to place it right side down over fabric one, and the machine will sew the seam. For step 17, you're going to flip your lead fabric right side up, finger press, and the machine will sew the tack down stitches. Then you can trim 1/4 inch inside the block, leaving about 1/2 inch or so on the outside of the block. For step 18, you're going to place your fabric 4 right side down, raw edges even, and we'll take it to the machine and sew the seam. Then you're going to flip your fabric 4 right side up and sew the tack down stitches using water-soluble thread in the needle only. Now you can trim 1/4 inch inside the block and leave about 1/2 inch on the outside of the block, and that will be trimmed away later. Place your skinny lead fabric right side down, raw edges even over fabric 1 and 4, and the machine will stitch the seam. Now you can flip your lead fabric right side up, finger press, and sew the tack down stitches. And now you can trim 1/4 inch inside the block, and again leave about 1/2 inch on the outside of the block. For step 22, you're going to place your fabric 5 right side down, raw edges even over the lead fabric, and sew the seam. For step 25, flip your fabric 5 right side up, finger press, and sew the tack down stitches. And here you're going to trim a scant 1/4. Right here on this edge, you're going to trim a scant 1/8 of an inch. You're going to want it so that the fabric falls inside the outside perimeter of the stitching. Now you're going to place your skinny lead fabric right side down over fabrics 1 and 4 and sew the seam. For step 25, you're going to flip your lead fabric right side up, finger press, and sew the tack down stitches. And then you can trim a scant 1/4 inch inside the block if necessary. And then you will take your fabric 5, lay it right side down, raw edges even over the lead fabric, and sew the seam. For step 27, flip fabric 5 right side up, finger press, and sew the tack down. Here you're going to trim a scant 1/4 inch. Right here along the outside edge of the block, you're going to trim a scant 1/8 of an inch, and here a scant 1/4. You're going to want to make sure that that outside edge, the fabric falls inside that line of stitching. Step 28, you're going to take your skinny lead fabric, lay it right side down, and stitch the seam. For step 29, you're going to flip your lead fabric and stitch the tack down. And then for step 30, you're going to lay your fabric 3 right side down, raw edges even, over the lead fabric, and sew the seam. For step 31, you're going to flip your fabric 3 right side up, finger press, and the machine will sew a tack down stitch. After the tack down stitch, you're going to trim a scant 1/8 of an inch on both sides. And again, that's so that the fabric falls inside of that basting stitch around the perimeter. Then you're going to take your wide strip of your lead fabric and you're going to lay it right sides down, raw edges even, over fabric 3 and 5, and you're going to sew the seam. You're going to flip your fabric over and sew the tack down. If your seam allowance happened to be a little bit too generous there with the lead fabric, then go ahead and trim that also to a scant 1/8 of an inch. And then for step 34, you're going to add your wide strip of lead fabric and you're going to sew the seam. If necessary, you can trim that seam allowance to a scant 1/8 of an inch, and then you're going to flip the fabric right side up, and using water-soluble thread, it's going to stitch the tack down. And here we're going to trim a scant 1/4 inch inside the block, and we're going to leave the rest of it there. This is step 36. We've taken some lead fabric and placed it right side down, raw edges even, and it stitches the seam. For step 37, you're going to flip the fabric right side up and it's going to stitch the tack down. Step 38, you're going to place fabric 4 right side down, raw edges even, over the lead fabric, and sew the seam. And then you're going to place water-soluble thread in the needle only, flip fabric 4 right side up, and sew the tack down stitches. For step 40, you're going to put your neutral thread back in the needle only and take a skinny piece of lead fabric, lay it right side down, and sew the seam. Step 41, you're going to flip your lead fabric right side up, finger press, and sew the tack down stitches. If necessary, you can trim to a scant 1/4 of an inch. For step 42, you're going to take your fabric 4, lay it right side down, raw edges even, over the lead fabric, and sew the seam. Step 43, you're going to place water-soluble thread in the needle only. You're going to flip fabric 4 right side up, finger press, and sew the tack down stitches. Step 44, you're going to spray the wrong side of your backing fabric with temporary spray adhesive and adhere it to the back of your block. Give it a little press to keep it in place, and then you're going to take it back to the machine to sew the basting stitch. For step 45, you're going to place thread C in the needle and in the bobbin because you have your backing fabric on now. If you have a machine that has an automatic thread cutter, it's a good idea to turn it off at this time and then bring your bobbin thread to the top before you begin stitching. By doing those two things, it'll leave a much nicer, neater, prettier looking back. And then the machine will sew the beautiful quilting. For step 46, you're going to place thread D in the needle and in the bobbin. And again, make sure your automatic thread cutter is turned off. Bring your bobbin thread to the top and sew the quilting. For step 47, you're going to place thread B in the needle and the bobbin. And again, turning the thread cutter off, probably is already off. Bring your bobbin thread to the top and the machine will sew the quilting. Now we'd like to walk you through the steps to show you how to make a whole cloth version of Patience. The first thing you're going to do is step 1 is you're going to hoop the banalizer with neutral thread in the needle and embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and it sews a placement outline. And then on the back of your block, you're going to spray the back of your fabric with temporary spray adhesive to adhere it to the back. And then you're going to take your fabric 1 and center that over the placement lines. Then at the machine, with water-soluble thread, it's going to sew the basting stitch. And the final step 3, you're going to put your quilting thread, whichever you choose. This is a polyester embroidery thread, in the needle and also in the bobbin. Turn your automatic thread cutter off, bring your bobbin thread to the top, and the machine will sew the beautiful quilting.
Patience block in the whole cloth version. We're going to trim it up so we can put it in a quilt. We're going to use our Trimmer by George 2.0. Imagine this corner right here is where your binding is going to be. This is where we will cut a 1/4 inch past the basting line. So we'll turn the trimmer over, line up the basting line with the 1/4 inch on the ruler, trim it off. Do the same on this side. Any block that gets binding on the edge, this is how you'll trim it. The other 2 edges will be joined to another block. So the way you trim that is you turn your trimmer over with the metal edge, fold back the front, and you're trimming off just your battleizer and your backing. You're leaving the front. So now what you'll do is you'll trim 3/4 of an inch past the basting line. And I used my highlighter tape to place it on the 3/4 inch line. And that makes it easy for me to find that line quickly. I can see better through with my black fabric. So there's your whole cloth block trimmed. These 2 edges will be joined to another block, and these 2 edges will get binding. This is our Patience block, the stained glass version, and we're going to trim this one to place it in a quilt using our Trimmer by George 2.0. These 2 sides, the corner here, will be where binding's going to go, so we're going to trim 1/4 inch past the basting line, turn our trimmer over, and line up the 1/4 inch with the basting line, trim it all off. Same thing on this side. So this edge and this edge will get binding, and this edge is where we're going to join the blocks together. So to trim that, we fold back the front, we turn the trimmer over with the metal edge up, put that under that edge, and we go ahead and trim it off. Do the same thing on this one. So now on the back you'll see we've trimmed off this a 1/4 inch past the basting, and we've trimmed off just the backing and the battleizer on those 2 edges. On the front side we need to trim it 1/4 inch from the basting line for our seam allowance. So this is our patience block all trimmed up. These 2 edges will get binding, and these 2 edges will be joined to other blocks.